The 19th of December, 1944. Dawn mist clung to the forests near Malmedy, Belgium. SS Commander Klaus Weber stood among 50,000 gallons of captured American fuel. For a moment, his confidence in Germany's Ardennes breakthrough soared. But as his men filled their tanks, one devastating realization struck him. If the Americans could casually abandon this much fuel, the war was already decided. Weber had discovered not just gasoline, but the crushing weight of American industrial power. In late 1944, Germany launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, a desperate attempt to turn the tide. The plan: push through the Ardennes and split the Allied forces. But behind this bold move was a fatal flaw. Germany didn't have the fuel. Hitler gambled that his elite SS units would capture enough American supplies along the way. At the same time, the United States was operating on an entirely different level. With petroleum pipelines stretching across France and the Red Ball Express delivering thousands of tons of supplies daily, American forces in Europe were consuming over 1 million gallons of fuel a day and receiving even more. Weber's Kampfgruppe was the tip of the spear. His tanks were powerful but thirsty. The Tiger alone burned over 2 gallons of fuel per mile. The math didn't add up. Weber had just 31,000 gallons for a 65-mile mission. When his tanks rolled into Malmedy on the 19th of December, they found more fuel than they'd seen in months. Thousands of jerry cans left behind by retreating Americans. Hot coffee still steamed in cups. Fires still burned in oil drums. The supply point wasn't even a major depot, just a forward dump for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. Weber's officers realized the Americans had abandoned more fuel in one depot than most German units received in half a year. They had captured 50,000 gallons, enough to move forward. But it wasn't victory. It was revelation. If the U.S. could leave this behind without blinking, Germany was in trouble. By comparison, Germany's synthetic fuel production had been shattered. Allied bombers had reduced it by 90%. The Luftwaffe was grounded. Training flights had been slashed. Civilians hadn't seen gasoline in years. Weber's fuel strategy was desperation masked as planning. His orders were clear: engines off after 5 minutes idle. Capture fuel above all else. But the terrain slowed them down. Narrow roads, muddy tracks, resistance from a single U.S. platoon held them up for 10 hours. The tanks sat idling, wasting precious gallons. They reached another depot in Stavelot containing 2 million gallons, but U.S. engineers torched it. The sky filled with black smoke as American officers ordered, "Deny the enemy at all costs." Similar scenes played out across the Ardennes. In just 1 week, Americans burned over 8 million gallons rather than let the Germans have it. Weber watched the inferno in stunned silence. One of his officers reportedly said, "They can afford to burn it. What are we doing here?" The Americans weren't running out. They were stockpiling. They were flying in fuel by the ton. Their pipelines pumped 1 million gallons daily. One truck convoy system alone consumed more fuel than Germany's entire army group be received in a month. Weber advanced a few more miles. At Liege, his tanks finally stopped, not because of enemy fire, but because their tanks were dry. Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that began the offensive, only 39 remained, and none could move. The Americans surrounded Weber's forces. With no fuel, the Germans destroyed their own vehicles and fled on foot. What Weber discovered at Malmedy wasn't just a depot. It was the end of an illusion. The war was already lost, not through courage or combat, but through capacity. Germany had elite soldiers and deadly machines, but America had factories, oil fields, and a logistics machine that could casually burn millions of gallons to win a single battle. In war, strategy matters, courage matters, but by 1944, industrial power mattered more. Germany had skill, America had scale. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't just fought in the forests of Belgium. It was fought in refineries in Texas, on pipelines under the sea, and in convoys racing across Europe. Weber crouched in the frozen Belgian woodland, watching smoke columns rise from burning depots across the horizon. His breath formed white clouds in the December air as he studied the tactical map spread before him. Every red X marked another fuel dump the Americans had destroyed rather than lose. His adjutant, Lieutenant Hoffman, counted the losses with grim precision. 87,000 gallons at Verviers, 120,000 at Spa. Each number hammered home the same devastating truth. The enemy could afford to waste more fuel in a single day than Weber's entire division had seen in 3 months. Behind him, his remaining tank crews huddled around makeshift fires, their panzers silent and cold. These were Germany's finest soldiers, veterans of North Africa and the Eastern Front, now reduced to scavenging fuel drops from abandoned American jeeps. Weber pulled his collar tight against the wind and wondered how long his superiors in Berlin had known. How long had they understood that this war wasn't about tactics or courage, but about the simple mathematics of industrial capacity? The radio crackled with reports from other Kampfgruppe commanders across the Ardennes front. Weber listened as Colonel Dietrich reported similar discoveries near Bastogne. Major Kruger's voice broke through static from the northern sector, describing American supply convoys stretching for miles, abandoned without a fight. Each transmission painted the same picture: an enemy so rich in resources they treated fuel like water. Weber remembered his father's stories from the Great War, tales of shortages and rationing that had broken the German war machine in 1918. This felt worse. Then, Germany had simply run out. Now, they faced an opponent who could afford to burn their own supplies rather than risk capture. Lieutenant Hoffman approached with intelligence reports captured from an American supply sergeant. The documents detailed fuel allocation for a single infantry division, more petroleum products in 1 week than Weber's entire army group had received since October. The numbers seemed impossible, almost fictional, yet the evidence burned in fuel dumps across the Belgian countryside. Weber walked among his idle tanks, their steel hulls cold to the touch. Each panzer represented months of German industrial effort, precious metals scraped from across occupied Europe, skilled labor diverted from other critical needs. Yet here they sat, useless without fuel. His tank commander, Sergeant Mueller, emerged from beneath the Tiger's hull with oil-stained hands and defeat in his eyes. The mechanical genius that had created these machines meant nothing without the petroleum to power them. Weber thought of the Ruhr Valley factories working around the clock, of the synthetic fuel plants the Allies had systematically destroyed, of the Romanian oil fields lost to Soviet advances. Germany had bet everything on technical superiority and tactical brilliance. But America had chosen a different path: overwhelming abundance. Weber pulled out a photograph of his wife and daughter in Munich. Would they understand that their husband and father had lost a war not through cowardice or incompetence, but because the enemy possessed resources beyond German comprehension? The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. Victory had turned to defeat at the moment of his greatest tactical success. Weber studied the intelligence reports spread across his field table. American petroleum consumption figures read like fantasy. The Red Ball Express alone moved more fuel daily than his entire corps received monthly. Behind enemy lines, pipelines pumped crude oil from liberated French ports to forward positions. American engineers had built a petroleum infrastructure across Western Europe in months that surpassed anything Germany had constructed in years of occupation. Lieutenant Hoffman pointed to reconnaissance photographs showing American supply depots. Each image revealed the same staggering truth: endless rows of fuel barrels, tank trucks lined up for miles, aviation gasoline stockpiled by the hundreds of thousands of gallons. The Americans weren't just fighting a war. They were demonstrating industrial dominance on a scale that redefined military thinking. Weber realized that Hitler's gamble had failed before the first shot was fired. Germany had launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, hoping to capture enough fuel to sustain the offensive. But the enemy possessed so much petroleum they could afford to destroy it rather than risk German capture. The fuel gauges told the story Weber refused to acknowledge. His remaining panzers showed quarter tanks at best. Sergeant Mueller reported that 3 Tigers had already switched to reserve fuel, their engines drinking the last precious gallons that separated mobility from abandonment. Weber ordered strict fuel discipline, no unnecessary engine starts, minimal idling, routes calculated to the meter. Yet even these desperate measures couldn't change the mathematics of consumption versus supply. Lieutenant Hoffman delivered the daily consumption report with grim precision. 47 tanks required 600 gallons minimum to reach the next objective. Available fuel, 320 gallons. The shortfall wasn't tactical, it was existential. Behind them, American forces advanced with the methodical confidence of an enemy who never worried about fuel. Their Sherman tanks moved freely, supported by endless convoys carrying petroleum products that German forces could only dream of possessing. Weber watched his men begin the heartbreaking process of preparing vehicles for abandonment, removing valuable equipment and personal items before the inevitable. Weber's radio operator intercepted American communications describing fuel convoys approaching from 3 directions. Each transmission mentioned quantities that dwarfed his entire fuel allocation. Battalion-sized formations moved freely across the Belgian countryside, their mobility unconstrained by the logistical nightmares plaguing German forces. Sergeant Mueller approached with demolition charges, the tools needed to destroy what Germany could no longer sustain. Weber stared at his command Tiger, its steel armor scarred from battles across Europe, its cannon capable of destroying any Allied tank. Yet, without fuel, this technological marvel had become an elaborate monument to strategic failure. Lieutenant Hoffman consulted his watch and tactical map. American forces would arrive within hours, advancing with the confidence of soldiers whose supply lines stretched unbroken to petroleum fields half a world away. Weber's men gathered personal equipment and prepared for withdrawal on foot. The irony cut deep. Germany's finest armored unit, equipped with the world's most advanced tanks, reduced to infantry by a simple lack of gasoline. The explosions echoed across the Belgian forest as Weber's men destroyed their own vehicles. Each detonation represented months of German industrial effort reduced to twisted metal and shattered dreams. Sergeant Mueller set the final charges on Weber's command Tiger, his hands steady despite the magnitude of destruction they were unleashing upon themselves. Weber watched 13 armored vehicles disappear in clouds of smoke and flame, victims not of enemy fire, but of fuel starvation. Lieutenant Hoffman organized the retreat on foot, his maps marking routes away from American advance units whose mobility remained unrestricted by logistical constraints. The men shouldered equipment salvaged from their destroyed tanks and began the long march eastward. Behind them, American forces would soon occupy positions abandoned not through defeat in battle, but through simple inability to continue fighting. Weber took one final look at the burning wreckage of his armored spearhead. Germany had sent its finest soldiers and most advanced weapons into battle, only to discover that victory belonged to whoever could afford to waste fuel by the millions. Weber's boots crunched through frozen Belgian soil as his surviving men retreated eastward. Behind them, American Sherman tanks rolled past the smoking remains of German armor, their engines humming with abundant fuel. The sound haunted Weber, the confident purr of machines that never worried about their next gallon. Lieutenant Hoffman walked beside him, carrying maps that now seemed obsolete. Sergeant Mueller brought up the rear, his demolition expertise no longer needed. What Weber had discovered at Malmedy wasn't just fuel. It was the future of warfare itself. Industrial capacity had trumped tactical brilliance. American factories, oil refineries, and logistics networks had won the war before his tanks ever crossed the start line. In the distance, American supply convoys moved freely across liberated Europe, their petroleum abundance a stark reminder of strategic realities. Weber understood now that Germany had fought the wrong war entirely. They had prepared for conflict between armies when America had built a machine for industrial domination. The Battle of the Bulge was over, decided not by courage or tactics, but by simple mathematics of supply.